Hey everybody, so I am back for another chat today. I do apologize that there wasn't a Heresy Hump Day this week. Part of it, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm running into a little bit of summer or pre-summer time issues, and which has been affecting my painting and even sort of enthusiasm for getting videos up, which I do love doing these, and I guess unless I really feel I have a lot to talk about for a chat or a lot to show as far as the table update, it is difficult for me to look forward to putting things up. And recently, I guess with summer coming, there's lots of stuff going on with the kids. We're approaching the end of the year for school, so there's lots of school activities. There's lots of things for the activities that they're involved with. And I tend to do a little bit more during the week for that stuff than my wife does, and so that actually ends up putting a bit of a time constraint in other things. The spring for me is usually a really busy time. I'm a dual citizen in both Canada and the US, and in order to maintain that both professionally from like a licensing perspective for my job as well as with taxes and things like that, I have to do a lot of submissions in the spring, and it's just one of those things where I have 4 or 5 things I have to do within a couple of months, even 3 to 4 months, and it actually also sort of takes up a lot of my time, and I've just kind of thankfully finished a lot of that, and that really feels good to be finished with that, because I'm sort of finished until the fall, until I have to do some things for my wife's business that I tend to help with, the back office stuff. And so having that stuff pass is really nice, but it's sort of affected my painting time quite a bit. And even when I have time crunches, I don't know if you guys feel this way too that have families, but sometimes when I have a time crunch, it squeezes in on that time they have even with your family, and I feel a little guilty sometimes because although I do have a tray where I can paint around my family, and that does help to be like just in that environment. It sort of My hobby room is really far removed from everyone in the house. It's like in the basement, very far from civilization in my house, and so it just makes me feel as if I'm kind of like getting away from everyone, like when I shouldn't sometimes. So lately that's been my sort of time crunch things that have been difficult. But recently I've kind of got back on the bandwagon here, and I've actually made some progress on my goblins. I'll show those for the table update in a moment. But yeah, that's mainly it. And I've also struggled a little bit with trying to do too many projects at once. I do find that sometimes it helps me to maintain enthusiasm to work on different things, but then sometimes I find I just start a lot of stuff and I don't finish it. So I haven't made much progress on that tower recently that I was working on, and I do want to make some progress on that. And then also even simple things like I got these like bases for sharps practice a while ago, and I've just, with the nice weather recently, rather than airbrush them, I just use a regular rattle can, and I just on a nice day sprayed all of those up, and I am going to airbrush those and get those ready so I can use them for sharp practice games. And so yeah, I'm just sort of juggling some things. And another thing I've been doing a lot of is that Warhammer Fantasy metal old style Beastman army. I've been just not even really getting anything ready for paint, but just as things have been coming in, I've been just dipping them and stripping them, I should say, and just working on that, which a lot of that just happens on its own. Once you throw them in there, you can leave them in there for days, and you don't have to do anything. But then eventually, if you want to make progress on them and do others, then you have to spend some time with a toothbrush in the sink stripping all that stuff off and then maybe redoing it again. And it does take some work, but I do enjoy bringing those models back to life, like when they've had paint on them. And so that part I don't mind too much, but it's just another thing that I could have been painting like while I was doing that. And so those are just all those sort of little distractions that I've been having within the hobby and outside of the hobby. But I am looking forward to the stuff that I'm going to show you, like coming up in the table update, and even I have other things around that I'd like to do. It's not really in like I don't have a specific plan to do it, but I have it sitting here as a reminder to do it soon, and I have the Marvel Doctor Doom that I've been wanting to paint, because I do want to still paint my Marvel stuff up. So it's just one miniature, and I just thought I'd paint that up pretty soon. I'm going to look forward to doing that as a way to practice some of my non-metallic metal painting, because I'm not going to use a metallic paint on them. I'm just going to work on my non-metallic metal painting, and I did that with the Green Goblin glider, and I liked how it came out. I felt that it wasn't an ideal, like, best that I could possibly ever do, but I thought it was like the best I could do at that time working on my non-metallic metal, and it looked like metal, even if it wasn't the most contrast and the shiniest non-metallic metal. It definitely had a metallic look to me, and I really liked that. I thought that was cool. So I'm looking forward to working on that a bit more with Doctor Doom, hopefully taking that to another level up. So I have some topics today that I'll read off, but before I do that, besides actually bringing my topics up, well, I might as well just do it, and then I'll actually show our sponsored alcohol for tonight. Topics, I don't know if I'm going to get to all of them tonight. I actually really was worried I wasn't going to have anything to talk about tonight. That's one of the reasons why I've just been slow into pumping out some of these recently, is I just have not thought as much of topics that I really wanted to talk about. But I already talked a little bit about the summer distraction, so I guess I've already started. But the other thing, a big topic I want to talk about tonight is miniature scale. Painting scale versus gaming scale. So, potentially a contentious topic, but not meant to be. But that's part of the fun of it. Maintaining interest in your games and miniatures. Second topic. And third, the feasibility of playing multiple games. The great lie. Okay, so 3 topics. We'll see if we hit them all tonight, but I'm going to start in that order. And so, before we go to the table update, what I have tonight is Alley Cat. This is a brown ale, an amber, and this is brewed in Edmonton, Alberta. So I'm not really a huge brown ale fan, although I've had this one and I believe I do like it. It came in a sampler pack that my wife bought. I do like some of the Alley Cat beers. It is sort of a craft style beer. Brown ales, I occasionally will like them, and I think this is one of the ones that I've liked more than usual. But I think the reason it's not my favorite is that I've always found that it has a very distinct taste when they call it a brown ale, that I've always associated with a very malty taste in the beer, a very distinct malty taste. And so I'm, like with my IPA that I love, my India Pale Ale, I mean, I really like a very hoppy taste, oak, in the flavor. I like lots of different types of ale, the floral sort of flavors, but the very malty, sort of strong malty taste that I believe is what I would associate it with, has never been my favorite. Now, I know that that's my opinion because, like my father-in-law, who I'll occasionally share a drink with, when he comes down from Edmonton, he quite likes a brown ale. And so he actually seeks out a brown ale, when having an ale, and quite likes it, where for me, it's never been my real favorite. But I do have this one tonight for our episode, and I am going to taste it again real quick. Yeah, it has that taste. Although, to be honest, it's better than many of them. Let's see if I can give you a color here. Yeah, I can. It's nice. They call it an amber. It's a nice amber color. Let's see here. It's not that light. Yeah, it is kind of dark. You put a light behind it, you can see it there. It's a nice color. Not too red. Definitely brown as advertised. On that note, here's table update. So for the table update, I'm just showing here what I'm working on today, where I'm at with my goblins, and just a couple of things that I'll be working on soon. It doesn't really seem like I've done much, but each of the goblins has sort of a bit of a different pattern for both the shield and the upper torso. There's 3 different types of upper torso and 2 different types of shield color. Everybody's got the same pants, and so it's taken me a little bit just even to get this far. It is tough when you have a huge mound of black primer all clumped together like this, like not even on the wolves. It's a bit of a disincentive to jump into it, and so I've had a hard time even kind of getting to this point. But even like last fall when I was doing the standard goblins, I do find that it gets a lot more fun once I get going with the green, and that's what I'll be doing today. Is I'll be starting to get green on everybody, and then I am going to actually put these guys, once I have the green, the first layer of green on, I am going to then attach them to the wolves and then work on the detail while they're on the wolves. I do find that that will clear up my desk a bit and get things on their way as far as these guys finished. I don't know, like it does help me psychologically to do little things like that. Like I said one time about just getting the bases painted made such a big difference. Just makes them look that much more complete, when I was doing my other ones. It's sort of the same thing. Like when I get these guys on the wolf and I'll have all the green on them and all the primary colors mostly done except for maybe the hats and the weapons and some of the details, it'll really get me going to push on these guys and get them done. I think actually once I get these guys done, I probably won't need much more to play at that point. I do have some other things that I can do, but I actually think my 35 goblins and my 35 goblin wolf riders and my 60 standard goblins with my HQ is probably enough to start going with small games. And really at that point it'll be fun just to add things. So I'll be working the best I can while talking to you guys, blocking in, starting on the green, seeing how well I can do that when getting involved in conversation today. Maybe I'll only get 10 done, who knows. I'd like to think I'll get more, but if that's the price of doing a chat, it's actually fine with me because I do enjoy these. As well, once I probably get a fair bit of progress on these, I'll probably either work on this pump wagon, which I've taken the grots off, or snotlings off. These are the snotling pump wagon. I kind of want to do this as well, so maybe I'll have this available to play. Oh, you know what I need to do? So I need to do at one point I need to do those nasty skulkers, which I have right here, definitely as part of my core group too. I might be able to play a small game without them, but I definitely need to get those quickly done. But then this as well. I actually put this on a base, and I actually used my normal plaster product, but I made I guess treads, like where it's rolling through, which I thought was kind of cool. So I really love this model. It's funny, I wasn't really that familiar with it when I bought this from a friend, but once I saw it, I kind of fell in love with it. It was like love at first sight. This thing is just so cool looking. I mean, it really screams Goblin. I really love it. I'm so happy. I mean, I don't even know how it works in game, but I don't really care about that stuff as much lately. Just love the way it looks. And so I'll also finish the base and work on another giant at one point. He's probably my favorite of my 3, so I am looking forward to painting him. So maybe that'll be a little bit of a reward when I finish some of that stuff. So yeah, and I've got some of my guys that I had before as just reference points, is when looking at the color scheme of what I'm trying to do, with the wolf riders. So yeah, so that's really what I'm working on right now. I mean, it kind of seems a bit like a mess at the moment that I'm working through, which the way I chose to do it, I mean, I don't know if it was the best way or not to do the goblins off the wolves initially, but it is, psychologically, it wasn't the best way for me to do it in some ways. Okay, so I'll get back to the chat. Okay, so now we're going to get to the goblins. Put my brown ale there. So I did actually go back and check a video that I did a while ago when I was doing my goblins originally, and what I covered these guys with was a 50% blend of light green by model color and scorpion or Escorpina green by game color. And so I'm going to just do that. That's what I'm going to put in to block off the miniatures to start with. So our first topic is miniature scale, painting scale versus gaming scale. Now, whenever you talk in absolutes about a subject, you're almost always proving yourself wrong as soon as you start doing that, because I know, most things are an absolute, and I say like a gaming scale versus a painting scale, and obviously most of our scales that we have access to in the hobby are both used for painting and gaming. The reason I'm bringing this up, and this theme you'll kind of see where my head was at this week and how I thought of these things, because a couple of my topics relate to my last video when I showed that AD&D battle system game. So that battle system game I showed before is actually meant to be 28mm scale. But as I said, I kind of got quite interested in it after I pulled that out again. I started reading it, and I've read through a lot of it, and researched a bit on it, because I'm really on this fantasy kick right now, and you guys know how much I like D&D in the past, and it really intrigued me to play a miniatures game that was based on a miniature war game, like not just D&D with miniatures, but a war game that was based on the Dungeons and Dragons universe. Really was appealing to me. And so I was thinking about it, and I kind of thought to myself that despite the fact that 28mm has been the primary scale I've always painted, and I would say that would be my scale because I'm most inspired by a larger scale. Now, you could argue there are larger scales than that, but that's, of the ones that are most commonly available, I think 28mm is one of the bigger scales. And I kind of thought to myself, well, what about trying 15mm? Because I don't do it. And it is so hard. Like, I've got big projects planned already, like for fantasy, like with my Beastmen for 28mm. I don't really want to even think about doing another 28mm big army project. But I thought if I wanted to do this, I can use my Warhammer stuff for that game, don't get me wrong, in 28mm, and I'm probably planning on doing it. But I kind of thought it might be neat to paint up a small 15mm armies, combatants, to try for that AD&D battle system. So I've been looking into that a lot this last week. And most likely next year. Like, it's probably not something I'm going to even consider doing in the very near future, but I just was looking into it, and there are some really nice miniatures for 15mm. I actually quite enjoyed looking into it. I mean, I think you can still capture a fair bit of detail with 15mm, depending on the sculptor and the particular line. But I was amazed at the price points, too. Like, you can really get a lot for a lot less money compared to what I'm used to spending. And that's really appealing. And even some of the buildings and stuff, to just try to get started with it, it's much more reasonable. And so I kind of thought, well, maybe I'll just do this as a little fun project on the side in the future. Just do a little 15mm AD&D sort of gaming. Because it just looked really appealing to me. And I might just focus on what I saw in the rules in the game at another point, because I think I'll go too much on a distraction on this video, but as to my reasoning as to why I like it and all that. Yeah. So because I've been actually thinking about 15mm, it's been fairly significant for me to consider doing a different scale. I almost, I bought and got rid of, it's one of the few things that I've purchased and actually gotten rid of because I wasn't using it, and planning on doing it, the Drop Zone Commander, which was in, I believe, 10mm. And now that I'm thinking maybe of doing some 15, it had me really just thinking about scale a lot, like just as a principle in our hobby. Now, I'm pretty, as some of you probably noticed, I'm a little repetitive in some of the things I bring to these chats. I'd like to think that I mix it up quite a bit, But again, I'm kind of talking about painting versus gaming again, but I'm talking today about it in reference to scale, which I don't think I really brought up at all in my last discussion. Now, the solo wargamer did bring this up in a response video. He talked about the guys that are actually painting sort of busts and large-scale miniatures because they're painters, you know, like, and he definitely touched on this subject and this concept of scale actually being a factor as to whether you're more of a painter or a gamer. I wouldn't say that he spoke about it in an absolute fashion, but he brought up the subject, and I actually thought about it this week too, as I started thinking about painting different scales. Now, I think the very in-your-face observation, first-level observation, is that perhaps bigger scales are more for painters and smaller scales could be more for gamers. Well, why is that maybe the top-level observation? I think that obviously, if you enjoy the painting more, you might be more into the idea of having detail in your miniatures. You know, a larger amount of detail. I think it's fair to say that the bigger the miniature, the more opportunity for greater detail. The smaller the miniature, the more challenges around maintaining greater detail. Now, this will obviously change from manufacturer to manufacturer, from technology to technology. But I think that that's the basic premise for that initial observation. I think that's the easier thing to start with, is that if you're a painter, you might even be interested in the even bigger and bigger things to paint that have more and more and more detail. I have still a bust to do that I got from a contest on YouTube from, it was the Morgue TV. I don't think he still supports his channel. I have not heard from him or seen for a while, but I still am planning on doing a Roman Centurion bust that's a nice size. It's like this big, and it'll really present some opportunities to refine some of my painting techniques. And right off the bat, that's like my assumption, like this is going to be good for painting, like this is going to be good to help me paint, because it is a larger scale. So, if you believe that bigger scales are the painter's scales, then conversely, smaller scales could be maybe more for the gamer scale. Now, why is that? Why could that be the case? Well, I think maybe it could be the case because you could have larger conflicts trying to represent bigger scale battles, bigger scope, not the scale as in the miniature size, but the scale of the armies, bigger armies scaled up. Within smaller footprints on your gaming surface. So the smaller scale could be seen as making it easier to achieve something for gaming. You could make the argument that the aesthetics of your miniature, your individual, in the smaller scale may not be as important if you're playing with bigger armies. You can make that argument. Now, like I said, I'm speaking in absolutes here, but there's always exceptions to this. Now, with the bigger scale games, you also can actually fit quite a bit more as far as terrain on your table as well. You can create kind of a bigger world in that sense, represented on the table. I think that's the basic things that come to my mind. I'm interested in other people's thoughts that may agree with this. I don't think that it's fair to say that people that like smaller scale miniatures or bigger scale games like that necessarily care less about the miniatures and more about the game. I think, although that's what the basic premise is saying, but I don't think it has to be the case. But I think people still want to have nice looking miniatures no matter what they're playing. They're still playing a tabletop game. What sort of dawned on me as I was thinking about this more, because I'm not a small scale gamer, so I'm interested in what the people that come from that gaming environment or have played both. I'm interested in what your thoughts are on this as I'm considering entering it, in addition to what I do with 28mm. But what it made me think is that one thing related to what I just said, that the smaller scale could allow for, is more focus on terrain. Now, I find that terrain can be a huge focus in 28mm. I don't think that it's insignificant just because the miniatures require a lot. Although, one thing I've always said is that, and I've said this as someone who plays a lot of 28mm, I've always said one of the biggest differentiators for folks that are focused on a game versus multiple games is the quality of their tables, because you can spend so much time painting miniatures for 28mm that oftentimes people don't leave enough time for gaming, or for terrain. For gaming too, but we're focused on the terrain, on the scale discussion here. And so, maybe that is part of it. Maybe the world that the smaller minis belong to gets more of a focus, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, that's actually kind of cool, because I actually think having beautiful tables is a huge part of this hobby. Now, some people that actually play, I can already tell that some people that actually play smaller scale still take quite a bit of pride in their painting. And it takes a lot of skill, I think, from what I've seen, to actually do this smaller scale painting. I'm talking 15mm is what I'm looking into, but when I see some people doing anywhere from 6 to 10, there are skill sets that I don't even really typically employ, that I'm sure you have to have. Maybe there are different aspects to painting the smaller scale that people enjoy that you don't see in the bigger scale. Maybe it's creating little unit stands and the aspects to that. Like, I know people do the 28mm unit stands and things like Kings of War, but it's not really the typical way to play the larger scale, is to make up like group unit stands, where that is something that's been done for a long time in the smaller scale stuff. So would you agree that some scales lend more to a painting focus, where others afford a gaming focus, and it's less of a painting focus? If you do one or the other or both, I'm kind of interested. I thought it was just kind of neat. Now, looking at some of the fantasy stuff in 15mm, I thought it was neat to look at sort of giants and dragons that are like practically 28mm or 30mm size, that are like towering over these 15 millimeters. I just thought it was kind of cool. There is a sense of epic proportion that you can kind of appreciate, really in both scales, but it makes it easier to appreciate when you have the smaller scale in some ways. Like when you have really small scale figures, it doesn't take much to like have like a Titan or Giant or something really look massive and impressive, and you're not actually spending a month's salary on it. Which is kind of cool. These guys are actually taking me a while I talk. I think in general it's just, there's a lot of stuff that I'm having to paint around to do these guys. I always tend at this stage to make little mistakes at times that I'll have to cover up later anyway, but I usually require several applications of paint for all of the main base paints, the primary colors on the model. But I'm still really at just number 1. And just finishing the first topic. So, I just had some initial thoughts on this idea of the painting scale versus the gaming scale. And I'm just sort of interested in what other folks had to thought about that. So, next topic is maintaining interest in games and miniatures. Now, I've had, even, right now, all the time right now, I'm focused on the stuff that I'm doing. I'm really looking forward to the fall project. I've acquired much of what I want to paint already for my Beastman project and the Old Hammer project. I'm really looking forward to that. It's first a painting project, and I am, like I mentioned, looking at using some of the original style paints for Old Hammer on them. So I'm really looking forward to that. But it amazed me, my own sort of twisted psychology of how I'm already looking at something else. So because I have that stuff in my possession, I've not even gotten my paints for it. I've not even put a brush on it, and I'm looking at it for the fall, and I'm really excited about it. Yet I'm already looking at something else. So sometimes I quite bewilder myself as to that psychological need to constantly be looking into things. I guess this D&D project is a bit, there are some unique aspects to it that I want to do that I'm not getting in my other games, and there is a nostalgic aspect to it that really draws me to it. So I understand why my mind is going there, despite the fact that it's already occupied with this Old Hammer project. But I ask myself a lot, how is it possible even for some of us to maintain our focus into the things that we like? Whether it be the game itself, because I think many of us are always looking for the next game, like miniatures aside, or the miniature eye candy of constantly buying lots of miniatures. Now, I already mentioned, it's funny because I mentioned Work TV already with that bust, but he was somebody that I was chatting with in the comments a long time ago about collecting lots of miniatures and the lead pile that we have. I think the assumption is that it's a bad thing, to have lots of miniatures. And he was one of the first people, not the only person, but one of the first people that sort of countered that and said, he had said, I'm a collector and I have thousands of miniatures and I don't regret having thousands of miniatures, even though they're not painted. So not having something painted wasn't a stressful thing for him in this discussion, and he viewed it as a collection. Now for me, the Old Hammer stuff, like these old things that you can't buy anymore, they're essentially out of print. I also feel a little bit like that if I have a bin Like, I'm planning on painting my Rogue Trader works very soon, but I've had them for a long time, and for all intents and purposes, they should be the first things that I would paint if I was doing things in order to get things done. But to be honest, just having them for me is, considering my love in the hobby and the fact that I'll want them anyway someday, like, it's all that really matters. So I can kind of understand folks that come from the perspective of collecting. So buying something isn't necessarily mean that you're not interested in what you've got. But sometimes I can't help but believe that with myself, and I've talked about this on the channel before, but with others too, that there's a consumerism aspect to this, where, you know, we're buying something, it makes us feel good to possess this thing, you know, we see it, we've got to have it. And then once you do that purchase, there is that tendency to be looking again. So while we're looking for the next thing, I think oftentimes we forget about what we have. And the excitement that we had for the stuff we already have is sort of out of sight, out of mind. One of the things that I've realized about myself over time is that it is very much an out of sight thing. That if I put something on a shelf in a box and it's out of my sight, even in my hobby room, I don't see it, it's really easy for me to forget about it, to no longer have an excitement for it, and it's part of the reason why things can contribute to a lead pile. But it's also, you just sort of lose a bit of passion for it when it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, and not in the plan, and just kind of sitting up there in a box. Like, you know you have it. The excitement of making sure you have it is gone. So how do you maintain excitement for both your miniatures and your games that you've already invested in? I think for me it's a little different, whether it's a game or a miniature I'm talking about. Since I'm on the subject of the miniature, it seems like very simple psychology, but what I've found is that the moment I take it out of a box or out of whatever it is that has me losing the visual of it, my excitement starts to come back. And I'm like, I kind of remember, oh yeah, like that's why I wanted that. Like, that is so cool. Because, like, my taste doesn't just change overnight. Like, the fact that I liked it a year ago means I probably like it today. But if it's out of my sight, then my mind is always distracted by other things that I'm looking at. And it sort of loses its place in my headspace. Now, at another level, if I actually start painting it and make a plan for it, so I actually pull my paints out and start working up an attack plan and how I'm going to do this, a creative plan, then my interest is kicked up another whole level of it. And I can actually kind of get to that point where I was to begin with as to why I wanted it. I do admire some folks that just are really disciplined about having a huge lead pile, and they don't have one, and they tend to have gotten to a place in their hobby where they paint stuff up that they have, and they don't really buy stuff until they've finished. I do actually appreciate that discipline. I do think that that's discipline. That's part of it. It could be being fiscally responsible with your not having like large amounts of your assets tied up in hobby stuff you're not using. It definitely goes it rails against the collector mentality. Neither one I think is wrong, being a collector or being someone that doesn't collect. It really is just there to have it to paint and wargame with, but is not concerned so much about collecting. I've mentioned Ralph Astley in regards to this in the past and with his historical miniatures, because there have been examples where he's had miniatures for quite a while that he was able to put to use later. So, when an area of interest comes up that you're interested in, you fork the money down while you can, while something's available, and then you have it in the catalog of your collection inventory for when you want to use it, for something that you've been on the lookout for, type of game. An example for me of that could be like the Wild West, where I just see some miniatures that come up and they look like they're really good, and like something I would want to use in a Western game, but I don't have any plans for it at that moment. I could snatch them up and have them ready for a future date. I've done that, actually, a little bit with the old Hammer stuff. I have some Bretonians that I like the idea of doing some Bretonians. So for those of you that, the historical folks might recognize the Breton part of Bretonian, but basically they're a human Breton sort of inspired fantasy group, but they would be like a human faction within Warhammer. So I have some of that. I have no plans for it, but I'm actually quite happy to own it. They're I see the old Hammer stuff as antiques practically, like stuff from the early 80s in my youth, and so I don't mind that. But maintaining interest, to get back on subject, of your miniatures and your games. Well, what about the games? How do you maintain interest? We've got another topic coming up that's closely related to this, and that is the great lie of playing multiple games. Lots of games. Lots of multiple games. Before I get onto that, if you play stuff, I know some folks that this doesn't really apply to because they just really play one game. And that they can have lots of reasons for that. In some cases, these games require a lot of investment. They're large-scale games. They require big, expensive armies, and it just comes down to affordability. Like, you love the game, you have no distractions to it because you don't play anything else, and you don't play anything else because it's too expensive to play anything else. And I can completely understand that. But with the advent of all the skirmish games that are coming out and stuff, it's becoming easier and easier to actually play multiple games. Now, when I say easier and easier, that's the great lie, but that we're coming into in a moment. But from an affordability perspective, it's becoming easier and easier. And how do you maintain the focus without getting bamboozled by the gaming industry to buy every Kickstarter and every game that's out there because it's either more affordable or it's just so cool and so different and from what you've got? How do you do that? For me, Musket and Tomahawks might be the best example of a game where I've been really successful with maintaining an interest. Saga might be too. Funny, they're both Studio Tomahawk games. But Saga might be a game that actually does that for me too in the long run. I don't know that it's actually, I've been playing it long enough to say that it's done it, but does it take a conscious effort to play games you really like? Do you ever play a game, like a game that you play? Maybe it's Bolt Action, maybe it's Warhammer 40k, maybe it's Age of Sigmar. Do you, after having played it for a long time, have to consciously tell yourself, All right, let's play a game. I haven't played in a long time because I really like this game. What I mean by that is you might say that's ridiculous. Like, I just have friends that play the game, and when we get together, we play it. What I mean is you might play multiple things, and you have to decide what you're going to play. And then after you've played something for a bit, you just don't play it for a while, and then it's out of sight, out of mind. It's like in a box on your shelf, and you have a whole bunch of stuff to do, a lot of interests. And you might end up picking it up because a friend says, let's play it. And you might say, oh yeah, I'm so glad we play this because I really like this game. And it's almost like a sense of wonder because you haven't played it in a long time. And you're like, why did I ever stop playing this? Like, I really love this. Is it the out of sight, out of mind phenomena? I think when you know what you like and you make a conscious effort to define that and recognize that in your collection of what you do, that it really helps if you're wanting to keep up with something to consciously make an effort to get a game in for those things. Because otherwise, I think you can get really distracted with other stuff. Because I think your core games can actually can prevent you, and I don't mean in a negative way, in a positive way. It can prevent you from just getting into too many things. When you actually get quite a bit of enjoyment already out of the stuff you have. So for me, I make a conscious effort not to get into too many things, but then I make a conscious effort to have core games that, and I've talked about this concept about having a core game or core set of games. I find that it is really helpful to make sure that I play them every so often. And because I've put them in that category of a core game, I inevitably always enjoy it. It prevents me from getting into too many things. And it's good from like a hobby dollar spending thing because you're utilizing like what you're invested in and you're not just hopping around all over the place. So that's my solution. That's the way I now. Having said that, there are like many of my subscribers and folks that I've subscribed to do a much better job at not getting into too many things than I do. One of my tests has always been, like I've said, is just to try to make sure that it has, when I get into something new, it has something that none of my other games have already. So I'm not duplicating too much. Unless, of course, I can use the same miniatures. If I'm just trying something just slightly different, just to get a different flair, just for some fun, if I can use the same miniatures, that's really helpful. And in historicals, that is often the case. Sharp practice is really enjoyable in of itself, but the fact that I could use my Musk and Tomahawk stuff in my table for Musk and Tomahawk was a win-win. So what is the last topic that I had? It was the feasibility of multiple games, playing multiple games, the great lie. So this really fits in tandem with what I was just talking about. Like, I think we often delude ourselves that we can get into as much stuff as we actually will do. And so it's sort of like a kid in a candy store. It's sort of like going to the supermarket extremely hungry. Like, you go to the supermarket extremely hungry, and you're going to spend a lot more money. I can tell you that right now. There's nothing like going to the supermarket through, like, the chip aisle and the pizza aisle and where the ice cream is and all that stuff when you're really hungry. I think that we often do that in gaming. I mean, I think the internet is a huge part of that, and the accessibility to information of what's out there and advertisement of various forms. Um, but I think a lot of us get into a lot of stuff, and I've touched on the subject of like many of us get into stuff and we don't get past the rule book. We just buy the rule book, and that's one thing. If you like to read rules and own a rule book, if that's what you want to do, I mean, if you're just kind of buying it just to read the rules, and you enjoy that, like I know many people enjoy just reading rules. I'm not really one of them, but for those that do, I can kind of appreciate the enjoyment that they would get out of just owning the rule book. But once you buy those miniatures, if within a year, like you still don't have your table made, or you've already moved on to one or two other things, then you got to ask yourself if you actually bought into the great lie that you know that this industry kind of sells you. That there's a lot of people out there that are trying to sell enjoyment to us, and no one of them is saying that you have to play all these games. But as a collective, they all are producing this sort of environment where there's way too many things out there. There's so much coming out so fast. It's quite amazing. I don't actually think this is limited to miniature games. Actually, I know a number of people that have a lot of board games. So many board games that they never can play them all. I'd argue that, they never will play them all anymore. They're mainly like a hobby room decoration. And, we all can do that to a degree, have stuff that we don't need. That's not just gaming stuff, but you can see like a wall of cardboard boxes of these decorative, beautiful board game boxes that basically take up an entire room. I know several people that are like that. And I guess the question is the reason why I call it the great lie that we can play all these multiple games for miniature games, not board games in particular, is something I've come to realize is that the tabletop wargaming is not designed like a video game console. You can have a wall of video games, you can have a wall of DVDs, and you can slip those in and play them for a bit. I'd argue that even video games can take a lot of your time, and you could potentially have more than you'll use. DVDs, you can argue even if you just watch them a couple of times, you've got your money's worth, and you could feasibly, at any time, rewatch one. What it takes usually for a tabletop war game to paint an army, be proficient in the rulebook, to build the table, to truly enjoy it. And it is true that some people game and don't need the visual as much. I find that most of the traditional games and traditional tabletop, the tradition of the tabletop hobby with the terrain and all of that stuff, usually requires quite a bit of time. You can duplicate some of it, and so you can argue that if you're into World War II Napoleonics, that you can use your forests and certain things, like some of your table itself, like your fields and things, like for both. And so it's not that it's all starting from scratch. But there's a lot of work in starting a new genre in many cases, and in whether it be even within historical or even crossing fantasy and science fiction and work from historical to fictional, there's a lot of extra stuff you have to do every time you pick a new one up. For most non-war gamers, the idea of painting an army alone is like where the deal breaker is. Like it ends there. Like that's how much work it is. War gamers oftentimes that are okay with the painting and don't have somebody else paint it accept that. I mean that's the cost of doing business. I mean if you're not into paint, you're into this to paint your minis. But even if you're into this to paint your minis, many of us will get frustrated with how much painting you need to do based on your desire to play all these multiple games. But then, and even if you do that, let's say you keep up with your painting of your miniatures, then there's the table. And oftentimes where I see people start to crumble and crack in their ability to live out their dream of playing many, many different games is at the table. Oftentimes you'll see the folks that are heavy into playing lots of different stuff with tables that are fairly sparse or have terrain that, hasn't been updated in a really long time, and it's probably because there's no time to do it, and it just isn't up to snuff. By many people's standards or their own standards, probably, which is the biggest marker, their own standards. But then it goes beyond that. Because when you play multiple games, it means you need to know lots of different sets of rules. That's easier for some than others. I'll admit it's harder for me than many people I know to actually maintain an understanding and a comfort level with the rules that I am happy with when I'm playing lots of different things. And I do think people break a bit there, because if you're playing the game and you end up getting all of it wrong, it can be frustrating if you're spending like the whole time in the book and this is a game you've played before and you just feel like really deficient when you're there with other folks playing, And so, what is like the litmus test of whether you can be successful at playing lots of different games? Well, any of the things I just said could be examples of whether you feel you're being successful at playing all of the games you've invested in. But I think one of the biggest ones is whether you're actually playing all of them. Now you might say, like for the folks that like to read rulebooks, you might just be a collector and you might just only own the rulebook. But if you bought miniatures for it, you may or may not have painted them, even if you bought it within the last 3 years. But the question is whether you've painted them or not. Out of all the games that you've bought into, that you have miniatures for, how many of them are you playing even once every 6 months? Now, I'm not trying to actually make this sound like an accusatory tone, because my observations actually primarily come from my own behavior. It's not primarily from seeing others. And sometimes where I do fall down in my observations is that I assume other people are like me, and oftentimes that's not the case. But sometimes it is. I mean, I'm a human as well, and people, I do see commonalities with gamers, with my own behaviors. But yeah, I think if you ask yourself, if you look at what you have and what you've bought, and both rules and miniatures and things, and you ask yourself that question of how often you play it, how many you have and how many you actually play, you'll understand whether whether you're truly able to be successful at living the sort of lie of playing all the multiple games. I touched on this a second ago, but I don't think I fully articulated my point. I don't actually think tabletop games are designed to be played in, how do I word it? Not in tandem, but I don't think they're designed, I don't think the hobby is designed to be played in mass, like tons of different games. Because I just don't think the time constraints, even for, and forget modern times, any time that people have basically been on this planet, with the responsibilities that we have, I don't think anybody has the time and headspace to paint armies for 10 different games and make tables for 10 different games and read rules and maintain a knowledge of the rules for 10 different games. I think the folks that do that and actually play those 10 different games on a regular basis are the exception, not the rule. I don't know what it is that allows them to do that, but I think that they're probably the exception. At any one time, I think I'm stretched thin on just playing 5 or 6 games, and a couple of those come with pre-painted miniatures in my case. I just don't think the hobby, the fundamentals of our hobby, that the hobbying part, the expense part, although many hobbies are expensive, but I don't think that the fundamentals of what it takes to participate in this hobby lends to playing lots of different games. Now, some of the assumptions that I'm making right off the bat is that in order to play a game, you have to buy into it. Playing somebody else's game, although may still require you to have some of the rule head space, it may actually throw some of this out the window if you're actually just going over somebody's house and playing with just their stuff and you didn't have to do anything. Money, time to paint, any of that. So that might be an exception if you're not having to invest. You may not even learn the rules. I mean, they just tell you what to do and you're just having a beer and whatever. Like, you're not that invested, right? Like, you're just enjoying yourself. And that's kind of different, I think. It's not the way I generally play my games. But I could see how some people might do that. Yeah. So I started out with the discussion of talking about maintaining interest in your miniatures and your games. What I've ended is really an argument to say that I think that there's a limit. And one of the reasons why it's important to have a core game and to maintain that. And it's okay to trade one out and say, I'm done with this, like, it's not a core game anymore, and like, I'm moving on to do something else. But I think it kind of, in many cases, means, you're replacing that core game with another one. And, I think that works. But I think one of the problems with maintaining that interest is the great lie that it's even possible in this hobby to play the amount of games that we think we can successfully. A lot of people don't really want to talk about it because you oftentimes don't hear about the games on people's YouTube channels that they talk about. Then you stop hearing about it, and they may mention it and admit it, like that they just kind of fell out of it or this or that, or you just may never hear about it because a lot of people don't want to talk about it when you invest in something, and then you sort of let it slide, right? And I have full intention. Like, I have those. Like, I have ones that I've just sold off. I have full intention of getting back into the World War II, but I've let it slide for sure. And it's just I've filled other things with that hole. I fully intend to do more of it again. Most likely, I will have to actually lay off of something if I do that, because I am pretty much maxed out on my attention span for things at the moment. Of course, we can let certain things bother us, and like having something you haven't painted, or having games that you don't play anymore sitting on the shelf. There's always going to be the mentality, and it's not wrong. It's sort of like the collecting mentality of saying it doesn't matter to me, like I'm a collector, and like I don't see that as a problem. Having lots of miniatures that are unpainted. There could be gamers that say I have no problem with having lots of rule sets that I don't play for the same reason. And there could be people that even go as far as saying I don't mind having it all and not playing it. It's up to me. I don't really... It's not a money issue, so I don't really care. It's not a space issue in my place. None of this bothers me. I just kind of do what I want. I do it for fun. And when stuff piles up, that's what it does. It just piles up and it doesn't really bother me. And so, like all of this mumbo-jumbo discussion that I'm having can easily just not be a problem for someone. It really just depends on how much you really think about this kind of stuff. For those of you that may have watched shows about minimalism and small houses and these things on Netflix, like this sort of like philosophy of trying to minimize your life and things like that, I'm not going to say that I'm a big advocate or do that, but I do have like an appreciation for it, and I've watched some of that stuff, and I think some of these concepts bleed over. But even like there, like to use it as an example, like where somebody needs to justify that believes in that kind of philosophy, the existence of an object in their house and its use and why that clutter needs to be there, and they justify everything they buy to include in the clutter in their life. That concept is very similar to what I'm talking about here with gaming. And it's not... I've been introduced to some of those concepts through some of that, but in the same way that you don't need to participate in a minimalistic lifestyle, you also don't need to justify your hobby and your gaming to anybody. Like it's completely up to you. But many of us are in the gray area, right? Like I would say I'm in a gray area. And like I have a whole room in my house dedicated to my hobby. So I obviously am not freaking out too much about how much the hobby takes of my life. For me, it's more time and headspace. And it's not... Some of it's financial, but it's more time and headspace than anything else. And actually happiness, because just to touch onto that minimalism kind of stuff, I mean, many of the people that do that are doing it for their own personal happiness. Like, they are happier without a lot of clutter in their life, in all of its forms. And I've actually made the argument on the channel that for me, and I think for some people, even in gaming, less is more. If you look at I regularly go onto Daka and look at like new stuff, although I'll admit I'm not really not nearly compared to before. I'm not that easily inspired by new things that are coming out. That doesn't mean that I don't actually have a major consumerist streak and I don't like to buy stuff for my hobby. I absolutely do. I find other things to buy. I just find the news and the latest stuff coming out lately has just not been something that's been a problem. When I say lately, I mean like the last couple of years, last year. I don't mean I'm not talking about most recent stuff in particular. I will say that I've seen the new vehicle that came out for the Primaris Space Marines, which basically 40K for me, like the Space Marine faction is starting to look like a set of Russian nesting dolls. You know, we've got humans, we've got superhuman space marines, we've got Primaris space marines, and we've got Primarchs. And they all are basically one bigger than the next. And it's just kind of a little ridiculous to me. I don't really like it, the lore part of it. But, and I'm not trying to down like 8th edition 40k, but when I actually saw this vehicle they came out that called the Primarch, sort of, I don't remember what they called it. It's some sort of new 40k. I'll throw a picture up if I can find it, of the new 40k Primaris tank. It basically looks like a Land Raider and a Land Speeder were eaten and then thrown up. I think it looks just awful, and I completely hate the aesthetic. But, you know, you always hear that whenever something comes new out, there's going to be naysayers, particularly in 40k, and I'm just doing that, I know. But that's just, there are certain things that come out that I do like. I love a lot of the Mechanicum stuff. But that thing to me just looks absolutely awful. So yeah, that's obviously been one of the things that I've not been compelled to buy for when it does come out. But I'm not actually just referring to that. I'm just kind of referring to Kickstarters in general. There have been a couple things that I was quite interested in. But in some ways, I've been pretty good at limiting my addiction to my own meanderings online and projects I want to start, and not getting really sucked into kind of what the industry at any one time is pushing out. I find my own ways to spend money and to feed the addiction, just as bad as anybody else, but it's usually not because of marketing and what somebody else is cooking up at any one particular time. But yeah, I think that's all I really have to chat about tonight for those subjects. I am interested in other people's thoughts on these subjects, because these subjects tonight in particular, as usual, but in particular tonight, are my opinion, but not absolute. I'm interested in other people's opinions on it, because a lot of these concepts are behavioral and sort of psychological concepts that really differ based on the person and their perspective. So I like to think that some people might think like me on certain things. I'm oftentimes in the comments on this channel, or just in general in life, reminded of other people's points of view, the validity of them, and just oftentimes it'll even change my point of view as well when I see somebody else's perspective. Okay, well, I have no idea how long I went tonight, and I got done even less than I thought I would. I kind of thought 10, goblins to get the base paint on of green would be a really small amount. I got 5 done. I got half that. I think part of it is there's a fair number of little spots to get into with these guys because I've got their shields on and their weapons. But I only got half the number of goblins done, and I only got about half of my beer drank too. So I'm working at about a 50% efficiency rate. But that's okay, because I really enjoy these chats. I like exploring ideas out loud rather than just in my own head. And I enjoy actually the interaction I have with folks on them. So yeah, so hopefully you guys had a good week. I am sorry that this isn't a midweek update. I am going to try to be a little bit better on kicking out a Heresy Hump Day. I do like maintaining that time slot. This is not my preferred time slot. This is Friday night right now, and so you'll likely be seeing this Saturday, I'm guessing, when I'm done editing and uploading. But yeah, here's to the week, and now the weekend. Cheers, everybody, and talk to you later.